It is often mentioned that the battle for sustainability will be won or lost in cities. Cities are the places where we live, where we work, where we thrive. Yet, as we saw yesterday and this morning, they consume over 60% of the world's natural resources and account for more than 70% of CO2 emissions globally. The world, as you know, is increasingly urbanized. People will need more infrastructure, services, water, energy, mobility, food. So we have to make it right. We have no choice. We need to accelerate this transformation toward zero-carbon cities. But not only zero carbon, but we also need circular cities, inclusive and resilient. How can we achieve this? How can we get the cities that we want? This is what we will discuss this afternoon together. My name is Cristiana Ciaraldi. I am a Built Environment Manager with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. WBCSD is a global organization based in Geneva that works with more than 200 companies, other stakeholders, and partners to accelerate this transformation. I have the privilege to chair this 1 hour 15 session on the carbon neutral cities of the future. We will hear from 4 speakers, and then we'll have a lively and informative discussions at the end. So save your questions for later. Thank you. I am honored to call on stage Rory Stewart. Rory is an independent candidate for Mayor of London. He's a former member of the Parliament, and he has served in different government positions, among which Minister of the Environment. Please join me in welcoming Rory.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Tom Hill. Tom is an environmental economist at the Institute for Public Policy Research. He is currently leading the organization Environmental Justice Commission, which aims to define the progressive case for a more ambitious action on climate. Please join me in welcoming Tom. Andy Galson. Andy is a professor of environmental policy at University of Leeds. Andy has an economic background. He has worked on environmental policy and management for 30 years. In the last decade, he has prepared low-carbon development plans for cities in the UK and all over the world. Welcome, Andy. David Greenfield. David is Managing Director of Sonics, Social, Environmental, and Economic Solutions, and leader of the European External Affairs for Circular Economy Club, among many other positions. Welcome, welcome, David. Luca Meini and Chris Grafnowski sent their apologies, and regrettably, they are not able to be with us today. So, Rory, what are the attributes of the cities that we want? What are the most pressing challenges that cities are facing today?
Whether you're actually able to hear me. You can hear. Very good. Okay. Secondly, I'm really hoping this is more of a conversation than my speaking. The fundamental insight that one has as a politician, or in my case, a recovering politician turned independent, is that there is something fundamentally fraudulent about the role, right? It's a fake role. I'm standing here in a whole series of different forms of fraudulence. We're in a great session talking about environmental and green building. We're standing in a building that I'm not sure in terms of its materials is necessarily the great example of what it is that we're talking about. And I'm talking to you when basically I should be listening to you. So what I'm going to try to do is sketch out some of the issues from the perspective of somebody who's the potential mayor. but then try to draw out some of the ignorance, some of the uncertainty, some of the things I don't know, and some of the reasons I feel that whoever is lucky enough to be the Mayor of London needs to do much better at listening and asking than in laying out a strategy and a vision. Right, let me begin by saying the one thing that is not going to save the world is mayors saying they have a grand vision for a green environmental city, right? Slogans, phrases of that sort are almost entirely useless. The second thing I'd probably say is be very, very wary of dates without plans. A plan without a date is better than a date without a plan. So be very, very wary of people who are going to stand up and say they're going to make the city carbon neutral by 2030 if you're pretty sure they're not going to be around as mayor by 2030 and it's going to be somebody else's problem to argue about why they missed the target. In the heart of everything that we do together as citizens, and I guess my theme is togetherness, right? It isn't about one person being mayor and everybody else somehow being citizens. It's that we're doing this together. Is that the big word at the center of everything we do is the word how. Not what, but how. How do we actually get things done? So, yes, there is a vision piece. And the vision piece is, broadly speaking, I, like everybody in this room, and I suspect most people in London, want this city to feel in 4 years' time a much, much greener city and a much more digital city. I suspect everybody in this room would also like this to be a much kinder city, right? A city where we really addressed rough sleeping, where we really engaged with problems around young people and families, where we really were thoughtful about a city of 700 villages, where you're always within 10 or 15 minutes walk or cycle ride of great community facilities with a flourishing high street, with great youth centers, with community centers, with fantastic green space. All these visions we share. Everybody in this room would like the Thames to come to life. We're not making use of the Thames. The Thames is very, very empty. Imagine the potential for transportation on the Thames, which we haven't begun to tap. Everybody would like the green belt to be greener. Right? Imagine planting the largest forest in England on the green belt. And we want to cut air pollution. Right? We want to get as fast as possible to a world in which there are no private vehicles in central London driven by diesel or petrol. We want to achieve an electric revolution and go further than that. But, in the mouth of a mayor or a politician, this is fundamentally bullshit, right? I mean, this stuff is very easy to say. Very, very easy to stand up. It's a little bit like those kind of National Geographic magazines I used to read as a kid, where there'd be a lovely fold-out of the city of the 21st century, with lots of strange pictures of trees growing on the top of buildings and people walking around smiling at each other, right? It doesn't mean anything at all. And that's what I want to just touch on very, very briefly in order to frame the conversation. The how, right? And let me just give you different examples of how. How number one. We understand that one of the biggest problems that we face in London at the moment is our boilers, both in terms of carbon emissions and probably nearly a fifth of actually our air pollution issues are coming out of our domestic boilers. The Mayor of London agrees with me. The Mayor of London has a lovely domestic boiler strategy. You can go on his website, you can read about it. Many of you in the room may even be on the special panel for domestic boilers. But in 4 years, he has swapped out 1,200 domestic boilers in a city of some millions of houses. Right? So what are we really going to do about this? Are we going to make a transition away from gas boilers to something else? How on earth are we going to achieve this within the infrastructure of London? Let me give you another example. All of us in this room, including me, right, are very, very keen to push the transition of vehicles very fast. But at the moment, a second-hand car, electric vehicle in London is selling at about £25,000 or £26,000. People on low incomes living in outer boroughs own vehicles which in the second-hand car market are worth £1,000. Even the transition that we are trying to do to the ultra-low emission zone, which is to get people to transition to a Euro 6 diesel or a Euro 4 petrol, involves somebody going from a vehicle worth £1,000 to a vehicle which in the second-hand car market is going to cost them £6,000 or £7,000. And if they don't make that transition, they will be paying £65 a week in terms of charges to drive their vehicle, which if you're on a low income in London, is the difference between meeting your mortgage or not meeting your mortgage. Therefore, we need very generous scrappage schemes, and a generous scrappage scheme in London, probably for this number of vehicles, goes into the £2 or £3 billion mark. So, in all these things, the role of the mayor, if I'm lucky enough to be mayor, is to be brave, right? To have fights, to fight for stuff, to have the vision, to listen to you, but also to communicate endlessly to people who are not in this room, to form the bridge between the people in this room and a lot of people who are not in this room, who are deeply, deeply skeptical, not about the idea of climate change or the idea of a green revolution, but very, very doubtful about the financial implications for their family, about the practical implications of what it is going to mean for them over the next 4 to 5 years, getting to work, getting children into school, heating their home, buying a car or not buying a car, and putting that on top of the other things that we need to think about at the same time. At the moment in London, if you do polling, I do polling a lot at the moment, as you can imagine, because I'm trying to become mayor of London. At the moment, it seems that something less than 7% of London think that the environment is the key thing that is going to determine their vote. 42% of people in London put safety as their number one issue, in particular knife crime and mugging. So in bringing this over, the only reason I'm mentioning this is if we are to get a genuine movement that is going to bring radical change, that's going to impose difficult decisions on people, that's going to involve raising taxes, spending a lot of money, putting a lot of investment into buildings, making radical choices on which developments to block, which to allow to go forward, and change the entire modalities of transport and life in London, then we need to get into the business of communication, and we need to get into the how, and we need to get into the priorities. And let me finish on this basic theme. I'll finish just on this. Final small insight that I would share is this. Don't let anyone think that talking about a digital future is different to talking about a green future. These things are one and the same. We need a digital revolution to actually understand more, both about the impact we're having on the environment in micro detail today, and the smartest investments we can make over the next months and years to make that transition as quickly as possible. Right? We need that digital information, we need that empirical basis on which to make those decisions quickly. And in relation to transport for London, right, we're talking about housing, but transport is probably our major single emitter and the thing that I as mayor have the biggest lever over. Data can unlock an extraordinary amount. Right, we haven't begun to think about what a proper, a really serious, flexible pricing policy could do to transform the way we move. From the smallest, right, putting a Fitbit on your wrist so that if you walk or cycle, you are rewarded for walking or cycling, and I can contribute that to your public transport costs. Thinking about the way that we can use data to target Amazon delivery vans so they're not turning up 4 times a day to your house, but instead we have some reasonable management of the way in which goods are moved around in our city. All of this is about digital. All of this is about data, but behind this, it's about the how. And under the how, and it's on this that I want to end, is the question of humility. Really must be the question of humility, because the risk in all of this world is mayors, politicians promising the universe, making great statements that can get everybody applauding, and failing to deliver again and again and again. Promising that we're going to swap out domestic boilers and actually only 1,200 boilers being swapped. Promising to build 120,000 affordable green homes and only 20,000 of those homes being built in 4 years. Promising to lead a transport revolution and nothing happening. So in the end, delivery and humility are going to be the key to create the green, exciting, bold, brave, kind future that we all want, but that begins with small, practical action. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Rari. Rari's busy agenda will not allow him to stay with us until the end, so I would like to open the floor for questions. So any question for Rari? The microphone, please, here. Please state your name and the organization you work for. Microphones. Who's got the microphones? I'm going to get the microphones. Okay, give me the other one. Yes, thanks. Please state your name and the organization you work for.
Hello, my name's Alexander. I'm from the London Reader. Rory, you said that we need to listen to people and also that we should be wary of dates without plans. So right now, the Climate Assembly has been called by 6 select committees from the House of Commons, and they're delivering a plan that the government must follow. So I'm wondering what's your views on that, and if you'd consider something like a London Climate Assembly to give plans to meet our carbon targets in this city.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm a huge fan of citizens' assemblies, and particularly of a climate assembly. I led an absolutely catastrophic attempt to be Prime Minister in the middle of last year. The center of what I was trying to say is that I wanted us to tackle Brexit through a citizens' assembly. I believe very strongly that Parliament was unable to unlock it, that the public was locked in a black and white battle between Remain and hard Brexit, and I really believe that citizens' assemblies, where you take, like a jury, 300 people in a room, absolutely representative of every part of society, young, old, modeled for gender, modeled for ethnicity, modeled for profession, properly selected, sitting in a room, going through the evidence together, produces much more radical, exciting, practical ideas than politicians can ever provide, and provide the courage to politicians to get on and do things. So yes, absolutely. If I am lucky enough to become mayor of your city, prepare for many, 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 many more citizens' assembly, and one that will begin on climate.
Jeff Beacon, the Pollution Tax Association. Are you being a bit too optimistic about electric vehicles? According to Carbon Brief's figures, a Tesla 3 will get through 30 tons of carbon dioxide in less than 15 years, and the personal remaining carbon budget is about 50 tons, according to Tim Jackson. And on high buildings, the taller, the more carbon they embody, and the smaller their heat capacity, so they're much more difficult to heat.
Yeah. So a good challenge from Jeff. Listen, of course this is right. Of course an electric vehicle is, particularly in terms of pollution, and this is true for a hydrogen vehicle too, much less dangerous in terms of what comes out of the tailpipe. But if we're really going to make a transition that is going to make a radical step change in terms of both pollution and carbon, because remember, even an electric vehicle is causing an enormous amount of particulate matter pollution from the tires and the brakes. And that's before you get into the embedded carbon within the batteries or the components of the batteries of the vehicle. We need to make much more of a transition away from vehicles entirely. I have lived in London myself now with small children. My little boy was born. I delivered him on the bathroom floor of my house in London 5.5 years ago. I've got a 5-year-old. I've got a 2-year-old. I don't have a car in London. I haven't had a car in London for, I think, nearly 20 years. And I don't miss having a car in London. It is interesting, though, how difficult it is to convince my neighbors of this, right? People will say, I'm very lucky. I live next to good tube and bus connections. But I would point out that the other people living in my street also live next to the same tube and bus connections, and somehow believe it is essential for them to have a motor car to move their kids around or get to and from. So I think many, many more of us need to be making the transition as rapidly as possible away from motor cars. And what a great city it is to do it in. I mean, certainly within Zone 1, there is absolutely no reason at all, really, for most of us to have a motor car. I mean, the range of connections available to us on tubes and buses is phenomenal. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you get out to outer London, in particular if you're making lateral journeys. And there we need to be thinking more about electrification and ride sharing. But I think this basic challenge that let's not get from a world where the same number of diesel and petrol vehicles are replaced with the same number of electric vehicles. Let us aim to reduce very steeply the number of vehicles in general. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rory. You're a straight talker for a politician. I just wanted to find out from you, you've served in the cabinet, and you know how strong the conviction is for a green economy. Is it really an ideological hurdle for the politicians to cross over, or is it an economic argument for us not to be really green?
So what is the problem with the green economy? I think the problem with the green economy all over the world is fundamentally a problem of practical political communication. For us to really win this fight, we need to win the fight, and if I'm talking about London, we need to win the fight with people in Bromley, in Romford, in central Kensington. People need to feel this. They need to understand it. They need to feel the transition. Look, let me take one very simple example, which really makes me depressed. The mayor promised to halve the current the current non-recycling rates in London in his term. And in fact, over the last 4 years, recycling in London has not improved at all. Right, we still have one of the worst recycling rates in the world. We're barely recycling 35% of our waste in London. Right, Germany, Berlin is doing nearly double this amount. It's disgraceful. And why is it disgraceful? It's disgraceful because we seem to be unable to coordinate between different councils on basic things. Everybody's running a different type of bin collection. Everybody collects waste in a different way. Everybody's got a different type of vehicle. Everybody's got a different type of recycling system. It is not rocket science, for goodness sake. I mean, if people were actually serious about this stuff, this is just basic management, right? It's not very complicated to explain how you do it. How you do it is you have a decision that you're going to have, let's say, one or at most two types of waste collection in London, the same types of bins, the same types of vehicles, the same types of recycling system, and you could almost certainly get up to Berlin levels of recycling in London. Why hasn't it happened? It hasn't happened because our politics suffers from a fatal double problem. One hand, people are chasing short-term votes, and they have concluded that it doesn't matter what they do at all. People are going to vote them in again, regardless of the fact they haven't delivered on anything, right? Much easier if you want to get re-elected to pick a fight with Donald Trump than to sort out the signaling on the Piccadilly line or sort out the recycling system, right? It's nice stuff. Let's have a big fight with something completely irrelevant. Because voters don't care about delivery. Voters could not be less interested. We've created a culture where everybody says, we reward politicians for saying it's all very complicated, it's not my fault, it's the fault of some other layer of government, it's the fault of cuts and resources, but I'm a nice guy, vote for me again for another 4 years. So if we're really to change this, if you want to get what you want out of a green economy, first you're going to have to get people who actually focus on delivery, and second, you've got to get people who actually know how to do things, who actually want to get things done. A lot of this is about a politics of the what, but not a politics of the how.
Any other questions? We can take a couple of questions. And who's the second one here? Was another question here? No?
There seem to be three questions sort of
Okay.
hovering around here.
So can I ask my question while you're getting more questions?
Yes, yeah.
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah.
Hello there.
Hi,
Yes.
you said you were going to have more citizen assemblies and that you've been a politician in the past. We all know that politicians know how to give a talk. And how serious are you about listening to citizens? You've got Citizens Extinction Rebellion, for example. Their number one priority is having a citizen assembly so that the people are listened to. if you were to become the mayor, and it's a very prestigious role, very important role. It's not just for the UK, but also internationally. What commitment can you give, and will citizens become something that is embedded in what you believe in?
It's
Name and organization,
That's it.
please.
I'm just a nobody.
okay. So I'm sure you're not nobody, but thank you. So 100% absolutely embedded. I mean, you can't hold a citizens' assembly and not listen to the results of that assembly. One of the reasons why I was unable to convince anybody else in Parliament, really, in the end, to vote for me and back my citizens' assembly is that politicians know that if you hold a citizens' assembly and the citizens' assembly says something, you have a problem, right? You've got to listen to what they said. The challenge that always came back to me is, yeah, but what if the citizens' assembly says something that we don't agree with, right? You have to take that risk, and you have to trust, in the same way that I trust in a jury, that we in general are smart enough, thoughtful enough, that if we sit in a room, listen to the evidence and deliberate, we will take that advice, and that will be the undertaking that I make, right? Simply by holding the assembly, I'm forced to listen to it. The only thing I would add to that is other organizations too need to take the same risk. And I've got very good friends in Extinction Rebellion. I'm not sure they've fully thought through what happens if the Citizens' Assembly doesn't agree with them and what they do with that situation. It's a risk for me, it's a risk for them. In the end, you've got to listen to the Citizens' Assembly if you hold one. Yeah.
Toby Allen from Studio Allen Engineers. One of the commitments that was made at the by the current mayor of the previous election was to put in a cycle and pedestrian bridge not far from here at Rotherhithe. And obviously that would have a massive impact on people's journeys across the river and cut carbon and all the rest of it. Massive, massive. He's failed in that, and he's pulled the plug on that project to put the bridge in. I mean, you may not know that much about the project, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how to help people in this part of London, East London, from actually making those kind of critical journeys to and from their workplace.
I mean, I think this is a critical question. It is an absolutely critical question, and I'm afraid the key needs to be thinking about bridges. Usually these tunnel schemes simply don't work. They don't stack up, they don't operate, so we need to think about bridges. There is, of course, problems about spans. There is a problem about heights of ships and all this kind of stuff. But there is a more fundamental problem. If you make a promise, deliver. Right? I mean, there's some sort of strange thing going on that these people are able to make umpteen promises. I mean, he promised a bridge. I mean, this is not a party political point. Right? The current Labour mayor promised to build a bridge. He's just given up on building a bridge. He promised to plant 2 million trees. He's now said he can only plant 450,000 trees. I promise you, I can get 6 million trees into this city. There's space for trees everywhere, right? It's extraordinary. But it's also true of the current Prime Minister. I think he actually ran a whole election campaign, said he was going to build a bridge to Ireland from Scotland. There was some kind of weird bridge thing going on, right? We've got to make these people put pledges up. I mean, one of the things I want to do as mayor, if I'm lucky enough to be mayor, is have a pledge card that says this is what I'm going to achieve in 4 years, and if I haven't achieved it, I'm gone. I resign. Boot me out. Bring in someone else. It's really important. I mean, when I was prisons minister, this is the only single thing I did was to say if I don't reduce violence in a year, I'm gone. We have to have a bit of a contract with the public. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. Right?
Last question.
Yeah.
Okay, my name's Neil Jameson. I'm from Citizens UK, which I started 30 years ago. I don't share your thrill about citizens' assemblies. I do about Citizens UK assemblies. The problem is that politicians can be dangerous to delegate the decisions they should make to a motley collection of ordinary citizens, and then they have to do what the motley collection of ordinary citizens do, who get really very little out of it because they then are discarded in the process. But the question is not about that. It's about high-rise buildings, which the gentleman asked over there. There is increasing evidence that the higher the building, over 6 stories, the more pollution it produces. Would you, if you were mayor, produce some sort of limit for the high-rises? I was the Poplar and Limehouse candidate for the Green Party, and I know there are 16 high-rise building proposals all around Poplar, which has none in it, but the Canary Wharf does, and this will put out the light for Poplar.
Yeah.
So there are serious problems about this.
Okay, so, I mean, unlike the current mayor, and unlike his predecessor, one of the reasons why developers are a little bit uncertain about me is that I am very, very explicitly skeptical about high buildings. I am a real believer in gentle density. I'm a real believer that actually a lot of the best effects that have been achieved in this city, some of the densest areas of our city, are areas like South Kensington, where you're looking at 5, 6 stories. And it is actually remarkable that you can get in far more people than you would have thought in a much more environmentally friendly way and retain a sense of neighborhood and street pattern and public space at that height much, much better than you can by skyrocketing up into the sky. So my basic intuition presented with a high building is almost always to say no. It takes quite a lot to convince me that a high building is the answer to London. I think the culture of London is very much about a medium density city, and that the opportunities for London are turning 1 or 2 story places in London into 5 or 6 story places, but not building 30 and 40 story towers. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So we've heard about digital revolution, the importance of data, the importance of smart investment, good density, the importance to listen to people. So at WBCSD, we have this vision within the cities program, and we say that we need healthy living spaces for people and the planet. We will not get there, we will not achieve the transformation we need if we do not involve people. We saw it with the Gilets Jaunes, we saw it with the riots in Chile before COP25, the protests in the UK. We need a people-centric design for cities, but within the limit of the planet, within the boundaries of the planet. So, Tom, how can we ensure and reconcile social justice and the green transition?
Hello, can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm from the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about the Environmental Justice Commission, which is a commission that we've not long started, that will be running over the next 2 years. It's been delivered in collaboration with Caroline Lucas, Ed Miliband and Laura Sands, and a range of other commissioners who are academics and civil society people from around the country. The aim of the Environmental Justice Commission is to make the case, a progressive case, for us to move further and faster towards net zero and to set out what that looks like, and to basically make the case that we need to build justice into the transition to net zero as well. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview to that today. I'll caveat what I'm saying is that as we're fairly early on in the process, what we're looking at the moment is the kind of questions that we're considering rather than the answers, which we'll be developing over the next year or so. So we move on. So, the UK climate leader, often, I think you'll hear that in the news all the time, the UK's climate leader. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that in some ways, but there's many different ways of looking at it. Often we'll be talking around how we've managed to reduce our emissions by about 40% since 1990. But when you look at it from other dimensions, such as consumption emissions, which many of you will be aware of, the prognosis isn't quite so good. It's a much slower reduction, and that doesn't take into account other things like our approach to extraction. So we feel like we've got a bit of a disjointed approach to decarbonisation within the UK. And can't hear me? Oh, hang on, they're just trying to turn me up a little bit. I can hear myself echoing, which probably doesn't really help. Any better? Okay, I'll try and be project a bit more. So, not just territorial emissions, but also consumption emissions as well, is basically what we're talking. UK currently makes up about 0.9% of the world's population, but historically we've produced 4.5% of the world's CO2 emissions. So arguably we've already had our fair share of the cake. So there's a strong moral case for going as fast as we can, whilst also recognising Rory's challenge that actually you can have the closest target in the world, but unless you can have a decent plan, it doesn't really count for much. And we also, in addition to counting for our territorial emissions, we also need to look at consumption and extraction too. So overall, we're calling to go further than what the current UK is looking at. So instead of just looking at production emissions, also looking at our approach to consumption and imports, but as well as, and then look at our approach to extraction. So the UK is currently committed to maximising the economic extraction of North Sea oil, for example. Those need to, in our view, need to be built into our approach to net zero. Faster. So there's a lot of talk around moving fast toward net zero. I wouldn't necessarily have a strong view on which date we should be moving towards, but what is apparent is a 2050 target on its own isn't as helpful as it could be. What matters more is the trajectory in which we approach it. So a rapid reduction in the next 5 years is more meaningful than, say, achieving net zero by 2050, but delaying action until 2040. So the key focus is not to be on what date, but actually when we start, really, which is the main criteria. And then today, looking at more fairer. So what's fair in terms of a transition, in terms of internationally fair? What's fair in terms of intranationally fair? So what's fair within the UK, taking into account all of the grievances that are raised through Brexit, for example? And then what's fair in terms of leaving a legacy for our children? So why does social justice matter? Well, the angle of social justice falls into two categories. One, which is the direct impacts of climate change. The direct impacts of climate change will disproportionately fall upon those who are most vulnerable, both within the UK and abroad. And also, there's a huge risk that unfair policy responses could actually undermine support for climate action on climate change. So here's just one example. If you look at the risk of flood risk, the high correlation between flood risk and social deprivation, the areas that are most at risk are often areas that are most socially deprived. And so poorly delivered transitions, similar to the move away from coal in the past, could deliver extremely inequitable outcomes and undermine support going forwards. This also applies to things like energy inefficiency. You look at the poorest quality housing, it tends to be within the private rented sector, which is predominantly within people who are less well-resourced than others. And then things like, same principle applies with overheating and also exposure to air pollution. All of these have strong social justice dimensions. If we get it wrong, this is the big risk. So the previous demonstrations in France, the Gilets Jaunes protests, show that poorly delivered environmental policy can significantly undermine action on climate and significantly undermine support for action on climate. So it's critical we get this sorted. Similar sorts of protests in the past, the fuel protests under the Blair government had a similar effect. Now, in our view, one of the key drivers of this problem is where if politicians or governments take a single lever approach. So if the approach is just to think about, okay, we need to put up taxes on fuel, for example, then that inevitably will lead to people being worse off. In order for policies to work, we need a highly complicated, unfortunately, but also multi-lever approach where we make pro-environmental behaviours need to get much cheaper and anti-environmental behaviours need to become disincentivised and harder to come by. So at the moment, this is some data just from a previous report that I looked at, but it shows how over a 50-year period, it shows household expenditure broken down by different spending categories. So back in the 60s, about 13.5% of people's income went on housing. By 2012, that had risen to 26%. Food back in those days was about a quarter of people's income, and now it's fallen down to less than 10%. Now, a lot of that will be around things like technology, but a very significant portion is about government policy and the financialisation of the housing market, also kind of globalisation of food production and so on. So policy can have a big impact on the way things pan out. And essentially what we need to do is there's we think there's 4 steps to the process. One is a kind of green financial or green fiscal policy, which has 2 aspects to that. First aspect is greening the finance system. We basically, at the moment, to buy a new washing machine or to a new vacuum cleaner, you can buy a brand new one and it'll be cheap. If that breaks, replacing that will be, is quite cost effective. But repairing it will cost you about 7 times as much. And the reason for that is that because of the way we tax labour, when you're working, the microwave or the washing machine repair woman would have a lot of tax on her labour, and there's a bureaucracy around how they fill in the tax forms and what they have to comply with. Whereas the company that imports a cheap washing machine from another country with maybe lower welfare standards doesn't have to pay those taxes. Now, we need to try and make it so that the tax system rewards the greener behaviour and makes it more tricky to choose the less environmental option. Another angle to the, so that's the kind of maybe a revenue raising angle of the green fiscal policy. A second component of green fiscal policy is actually spending. This is where the traditional Green New Deal narrative comes in. Now, we need to invest in opportunities that will make it easier for people to choose green options. So at the moment, it's cheaper to fly. If I want to go, say I wanted to go to COP in November, it's easier for me to fly to COP. It would be cheaper than for me to get a train up there. That is crazy in terms of an environmental, policy. So what we, as well as looking at how those are taxed and the financial implications of that, we also need to invest in the infrastructure that we need to make it easier to choose. So we need to make it easier for people to use public transport to get up there, and that's why we need to divert investment into green infrastructure. So we need, in our view, I think I may be getting cool. We need to a green investment bank, which will help invest in universal sustainable income infrastructure. That builds upon the idea of the universal basic infrastructure concept. We also need to, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work for decarbonisation. Even if you just take something and one area, such as housing or buildings, each house and building is going to be different to another one, and a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. So, in line with what Rory's saying, actually, what we think is that there's going to be need to a devolved missions. So rather than having just a UK-wide approach to net zero, we need to devolve that to the regions. And importantly, we need to give powers to the regions in order to be both economic and political powers in order to be able to deliver on those. And we think that those should engage citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies as part of that process. And then we think that we need just transition funds as well. So there's going to be some types of industry that we basically need to scale down as part of the transition to net zero. We need to get plans in now for how we do that, what those industries, what those parts of the country will look like going forwards, and what those people will do instead, and actually how they get there. I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you. So we saw that poorly delivered policy will not work, and that cities control roughly, I would say, 20% of their emissions, so consumption emissions are tough to tackle. But more and more cities are stepping up and announcing ambitious climate goals. How can cities deliver on the Paris Agreement and on the SDGs, Andy? So please, just talk loud and clear. We have a lot of competition here.
Of course.
Thanks.
So hello, I'm Andy Gouldston. I chair the Leeds Climate Commission. The Leeds Climate Commission is a local initiative, a bottom-up initiative to bring the public, private, third sectors from across the city together to take kind of collective action, collective responsibility for leading the climate change agenda in the city. It very much builds on some of the things that both Rory and Mark have just talked about, which is, Tom has just talked about, guided by the aspiration, I suppose, that the transition at the city scale is something that has to be done by the city and for the city rather than done to the city. and this involves new forms of engagement and new forms of kind of mobilization, which is what I work on. So I won't go through this in detail, but the climate science is increasingly clear about what we need to do and where we're headed unless we do those kind of things. So we're currently headed towards 5 degrees, well into the realms of dangerous runaway climate change. If countries deliver on their Paris commitments, then we'll maybe limit that to 3 degrees. Until 2 years ago or so, we thought that the thresholds and the tipping points where we enter into the realms of dangerous or runaway climate change and stop being in control of our future were around 2 degrees. And then the IPCC report said actually those tipping points are more like 1.5 degrees. And that's really behind why we now have such intensity and ambition and action for rapid change in this kind of area. But those are global budgets, and we know the global carbon budget compatible with staying within 1.5 degrees. How does that translate down to city scale? So for Leeds, our share of the global carbon budget, if you divide the global budget up by population, is 42 million tons. And currently, as a city, collectively, across everything we do, our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, we are emitting about 4 million tons of carbon a year equivalent. That means we use our share of the total carbon budget within 10 years. So our ambition as a start was to say, well, how do we stop doing that? How do we avoid going over our share and staying within those kind of tipping points? So we know as a city that we are currently roughly half down on our 1990 levels of emissions for Scope 1 and 2. Tom made a very good point about consumption-based emissions, and these are higher, but this is the narrower scope. We also know, if we look forward, that we think that by 2050, with ongoing economic growth, with population growth, with improvements in energy efficiency, but also with decarbonization of electricity, we think we'll be 56% down by 2050. So that's kind of good, but it's a long way short of where we need to be to stay within our carbon budget. And when we take that into account, we have to move from that solid line to the dotted line. And as Rory was saying, it's easy to say that, easy to recognize that, but much harder to do that and come up with a plan. What we did in Leeds was divide that into 5-yearly carbon budgets. And what these show is that currently we are 42% down on 2005 levels, which is the baseline for most UK local authorities. But by 2025, we need to be 70% down. And by 2030, we need to be 85% down. So that really means that the bulk of what we need to do in the next 30 years has to happen in the next decade. And that's why I think it's completely fair and appropriate to call this a climate emergency and to have a climate emergency plan. Actually, what happens after that isn't quite so crucial. It's important, but really, it's all about the next 10 years. So how do we, in an inclusive, just way that takes the population of Leeds with us, how do we plan to make those kind of carbon cuts? So this is all about closing the gap between the top line, that solid line, and where we're headed under kind of business as usual to get towards that dotted line, or where we need to get to under our science-based targets. Now, we have analyzed this in a detailed way as a commission. One of our roles is to kind of provide evidence to guide this transition. And we think that the first half of that gap can be closed through things which are economically viable and ought to more than pay for themselves. So this is the kind of no-brainer section of our carbon plan, which is about doing the cost-effective things and many times also the socially beneficial things across the domestic. And as you can see from this, when we break it down, the transport sector has a key role to play in helping to close that gap, and then other sectors too. And these are mundane things we already know about. There's no need for rocket science or for major tech breakthroughs here. It's just deploying things we already know, which again supports Rory's point earlier. This is about what and how to, it's about how to deliver it rather than what to do. We then know that the next slither is technically viable using existing options, all the familiar things in houses and buildings and transport and industry, but it's not directly cost effective. So this would create wider benefits in terms of air pollution and public health and fuel poverty and job creation and so on. But this is slightly more challenging, and that would deliver another 16%. So 2/3 of what we need to do we already know about. Now, what we did a year ago was to kind of brainstorm this as a commission and say, okay, how can we close the remaining gap? What are the kind of things that we could do? And we came up with 10 different options. And those are H21. For those of you not familiar with that, there's a proposal to replace natural gas heating across Leeds and much of the wider northeast region with hydrogen-based heating, with the hydrogen decarbonised with CCS. That would deliver another small sliver. And then the top 10 energy users across the city contribute roughly 10 to 15% of the city's carbon footprint. And we have formed a club to say, well, the city's made this commitment and a declaration to a climate emergency. Will you match that commitment and do the same kind of thing? Currently, 6 of the 10 have committed to do something similar. That delivers another section. Then accelerated buildings retrofit to deep retrofit standards by 2030, accelerated district heating, accelerated EV adoption, and so on. All of those things together can close the gap. And that was instrumental, I think, in persuading the city that it's realistic to have a net zero target, that we know Leeds being Leeds said, well, we want to have a plan before we set a target. The plan is there and it is viable. Moving on to the consumption-based point, we also looked at 3 consumption-based measures to see what kind of contribution these could make. The first one was reducing meat and dairy consumption across the city by 1/3 by 2030. Actually, social trends are well on track to deliver that anyway, and if that happens, that would lead to a 4% closure of that gap. Similarly, a big investment in wood-based buildings and in green infrastructure and a reduction in concrete and steel consumption by 1/3 would make a similar contribution. Quite what the impact of HS2 on that would be is not quite clear for us as a city yet. And then finally, reduce food and reduce food waste could deliver quite a chunk too. So we think we can get beyond net zero using these kind of options. The question then is, well, how to do it? So the first slither of that is economically very positive. So Leeds has an energy bill as a city of £1.2 billion a year. And we think Leeds could save £277 million a year just by doing the cost-effective things. And in the process could create 4,000 years of extra employment as a city. So that's the easy section, relatively. It still involves raising £200 million a year in investment through the 2020s. So much of what we do as a commission is to focus on finance. And Leeds as a city is about to issue its first green bond in a few weeks' time at small scale, but to grow to explore and open up the potential of community financing. So residents of Leeds have £2 billion sat in their ISA accounts. If we can mobilize that and encourage them to invest even 10% of that in low carbon actions within the city, then we can deliver on a lot of our ambitions here, as well as kind of reconnecting people with place and making them feel more civic, and being able to go and swim in the swimming pool that they help to heat and meet the job they help to create, and so on. The Leeds Climate Commission is an attempt to bring the city together to take responsibility for this ambitious agenda. I mean, austerity has bit local authorities so hard, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that somehow leaving this to the council to deliver on their own is not fair and probably won't be that effective. So the Commission is an attempt to bring together all of the major actors across the city to build our collective capability. We're here to be positive. We're here to act as a committee on climate change, but at the city scale, and to monitor and track, but also to guide and support and to catalyze action at the city scale. So we were established 4 years ago. These are our core members. They involve developers, energy companies, water companies, waste companies, transport companies, the health service, the Environment Agency, civic trust, faith groups, and so on. And this is an attempt to kind of breathe some energy and positivity and empowerment into local action on climate change. And this model is now being replicated in Edinburgh and Belfast, in Surrey and Croydon, in multiple other places across the world and across the UK at the moment. So if you're interested in hearing more, please go to our website for PCAN. Part of what we do is also to be very positive and success-focused. There was a feeling in the city that there wasn't much happening. Actually, there's loads happening, but we need to kind of acknowledge what's going on and be positive, so share good experiences and energize people from doing so. And then our priorities. So set up an independent climate commission, which we've done. And thereafter, our joke is that you can choose any low-carbon measure from a suite of several hundred that you like, as long as you choose all of them, and then think of some others, and then stop doing the negative ones. So no major challenges there, especially for a city that's thinking of expanding its airport. And then just quickly, other things we've been doing. We published a position paper on aviation and airport expansion, which showed just how significant a dent that would make on our carbon budget. We've run a citizens jury that finished in November, a massively positive, energizing experience for all of us. We've had a big Leeds climate conversation where we presented at 80 different events and heard from 8,000 people on the kind of transition they wanted. We had a State of the City event in January looking at how the city can come together in all of these areas. And at the moment, we're in the midst of developing a review of how ready we are to take climate action across the city with a view to publishing an investment prospectus, hopefully, if I get my way, emphasizing community investment rather than big institutional investment to fund this transition ourselves and benefit from it directly. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Wonderful example of an ambitious city. So how can good governance and circular economy help us achieve all this? David.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. I haven't got 2 presentations worth of slides, unfortunately, so I'm going to try and make it nice and quick so we can have some questions, because we want to have a decent debate. So, yeah, I'm David Greenfield. I'm Managing Director of SONEX, a research and innovation practice, but I'm also the European External Affairs for something called the Circular Economy Club. If you're interested in circular economy, just out of interest, how many people recognize the term circular economy here? That's a goodish show of hands. Those of you who didn't put your hands up, go and have a look at the Circular Economy Club. It's free to join, and there's lots of really useful information on there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our challenges and then look at some of our solutions. And this is a statement that resonates exceptionally well now. To waste to destroy our natural resources. If we think of things like Australia, some of the floods that we've had, this was actually made by Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. We're not talking about new challenges, we're just talking about people understanding some of the things that we've been talking about for a long time. But we are in a different paradigm. 70% of our population will live in urban areas by 2050. And we need, as a UK, 300,000 new homes. Some of those statistics are very good for a lot of people in this hall. There's a lot of business to be had, but actually the impact on the environment, which one should say is probably our customer, needs to be considered significantly more. This statistic is really quite scary. Most of the buildings, most of the infrastructure that we have in place was designed, and the impact was designed in at the beginning. We need to understand when we're building new stuff and retrofitting existing stuff what the environmental impact is. Because actually, by 2050, this statistic just blows my mind. 75% of the infrastructure that will be on this globe in 2050 does not currently exist. That means that we are going to be building across the globe huge swathes of infrastructure. And we've seen that with Wuhan and the fact that China can build a hospital in a week. Wuhan is a bigger city than London. China has got cities popping up bigger than London every other year. The infrastructure that we're building, if we don't design environmental consideration, if we don't design in sustainability and circular economy, will mean that we end up with a legacy that is not fit for future generations. I mentioned money. There's a lot of money involved in this. This is just the UK capital investment from the National Infrastructure Delivery Plan. Talking huge swathes of money. What's it all for? I think we've had quite a few really good examples of why we should be doing this. This is possibly one of my favorite cartoons. Unfortunately, I can't claim it's mine. There's still a lot of people going, what if it's a hoax? What if we create a better world for nothing? We want those outputs. It doesn't matter about the deniers. We've got to get on with it. And one of the things that local councils has done is declare climate emergency. It's been mentioned a couple of times. 75% of councils have now declared a climate emergency. I've worked in public sector for 20 years. I'm going to be nice to my colleagues in public sector. Many of them know exactly what they've done. Many of them don't know what they've actually committed to. And that's one of the challenges. The climate emergency is declaring knowledge that something's wrong. Doesn't mean that we have the solutions. One of the cities I'm working in, and we're supporting on delivering a circular economy route map, is Brighton and Hove. A relatively small city on the south coast, very diverse, very ethnically diverse, with a Green politician, Green MP, mixed people. I could have come and talked to you about the sustainability team here, but I've got in front of you the economic development strategy. Circular economy is about understanding the economics of a local area, a local community. I was lucky enough to be asked to comment on their chapter on Sustainable City before it was published. And you can just see at the bottom that we've got create a circular economy framework, incorporating the SDGs. For those of you who don't know the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, to 2035 for priority sectors. That's quite an ambition. It comes back to Rory's sense that actually plans without dates are possibly better than dates without plans. As it is, we've got 15 years to come up with a strategy. We'll be launching the strategy, hopefully, later this year. I'm not going to claim a date because we're trying to get it right rather than working to a default date. Some of you will know this graph, and one of the reasons why we're looking at the built environment in Brighton and Hove is because of the impact, and it's already been talked about, that the impact for new and retrofit of buildings from a carbon perspective, from a materials perspective, from a sustainability perspective, massive. These are some of the solutions. Have a look, and they're linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there's 17. We've had quite a short journey. Many people in the City Council didn't know what circular economy was 18 months ago. Many of them still don't. But what we have done over the last 12 months is bring a huge number of people on the journey to understanding what circular is, and also understanding what it means to them. We've got the whole of the architecture team from Brighton Hove City Council up here today. We've also got planners, and we've got housing officers. People are really embracing this. And why are they embracing it? Because it's so complicated in many ways. When we talk about circular, we talk in many cases about one building. Actually, the building, the infrastructure has got different lifetimes, and I would recommend you having a look at this report just to understand how different phases of development can have different approaches. And that's what we're doing in Brighton. We're looking at the design phase. So for new builds, how can we incorporate circular economy interventions? These are some of the examples. You'll know most of these. Design out waste, design in modularity, etc., etc. We're trying to make this relevant to individuals who do this as part of their day job. Understanding the manufacture and supply of materials. Again, maybe not the best slide. I think I'll have to change the color of the writing. But you can see some of the solutions there. Using less hazardous materials, take-back schemes, all sorts of things, and putting it into different phases and understand the opportunities at each of these stages. The construction phase. How do we have off-site construction? How can we procure reused materials? How can we minimize waste? Lots and lots of solutions out there that many people don't actually attribute to circular economy, but in many cases attribute to sustainable development or just sensible design or reuse. There's so many different terminologies. We've got to be very careful not to exclude people because they don't know what the terminology is. We have in-use and refurbishment phase. Lots and lots and lots of opportunities to reduce carbon, to reduce waste, and to make it a much more socially pleasurable place to live. We also have to think about the future, which is why we've got some interesting robots sitting behind there. AI, data, machine learning is on its way, and it's going to help us, but it will also hinder us if we don't understand it. End of life phase. We need to think about what happens when things stop. How can we reuse it? How can we remanufacture it? How can we repurpose it? Let's not demolish things. Let's deconstruct. Let's reuse. Let's rebuild. Finally, I just want to say what we've done in Brighton and Hove is really quite exciting. We've taken 125 council officers through training over the last 6 months, looking at how we can deliver circular economy in a city. Now, we haven't gone and spoken to all the sustainability officers because the sustainability officers know this. We've gone to the procurement team, the maintenance teams, the economic development teams, the retail teams in the city, and helped them understand what circular economy means to them. And we've had some successes. Some of you that have been to Brighton will know Madeira Drive. It's currently going through a refurbishment, and circular economy principles are being adopted as part of that refurbishment. The same with the building in the middle, Shelter Hall, which is being refitted internally using circular economy principles. And the University of Brighton is working with the City Council to deconstruct an existing building, lay it out on a school playground, and then reconstruct it with 60 experts from around Europe. A really, really exciting Interreg project. And I should mention that actually one of the things we're doing is collaboration. So the University of Sussex, the University of Brighton, Brighton Hove City Council and Circular Brighton Hove have all contributed to making sure that this can be delivered. And I will leave you with this. For me, the way forward is we need to look at life cycle thinking in the building and to get the right champions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Circular economy is certainly a key solution for reducing both resource consumption and CO2 emissions. And we need to take the right decision at the beginning of the construction process. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A and for discussions with you. So I would like to open the floor to the audience. So who's got questions for our panelists? Any questions? Please state your name and organization. Thanks.
Jeff Beacon, the Pollution Tax Association. Sorry, it's me again. I look forward to the Leeds Commission doing some innovative things like some nice big posters on the way to the airport, "Don't fly, it's evil." I look forward to you doing some demographics to show which demographic groups are polluting the most so that we can get a grip of that. And wouldn't it be a nice surprise if you said to Leeds Council you can't build motorist estates anymore and follow the Brighton example?
Is that a question?
The question is, why don't you do it?
We have done some of those things already. We published an aviation strategy paper in December, which made clear who flies and how significant their impacts are. And 1% of the population takes 20% of the flights. 20% of the population takes 70% of the flights. Hang on, I'll give you ground in a second. And half the population don't fly at all. So designing policies to tackle aviation, it's something that's very hard at the local or regional level to do. It needs a national aviation strategy. And I think last week in Heathrow was a big step forward in that respect.
What about some nice big posters saying, "Don't fly"?
That's not quite our job, but yeah, well, we don't have the resources to do it. If you want to fund us, we'll be happy to consider it.
Other questions? We have another question. Yes.
Get me the planning permission.
Please state your name and organization.
Thanks very much. Simon Petley from Enviromarket. I might be a bit cheeky and ask two questions, actually. The first was quite specific about the green bond that Leeds is issuing. That's a fantastic development. And you mentioned that local investors might get an opportunity to invest in this. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, how it was being marketed, whether there's any incentives for local investors, taxpayers, ratepayers to benefit. The second question was probably directed towards the last speaker, who did actually partially answer it, I think. But I was interested to know the extent to which circular economy is embedded in the planning process at the moment, and if not, what more can be done and what should be the immediate priority?
Okay. We'll go first?
Yeah, so thanks to the question about the green bond. It's not all signed and sealed yet, but it's close as I understand it. The basic model is to raise, it's a tiny pilot, but hopefully will scale quickly. It's to raise $1.5 million to put solar panels on leisure centre roofs. If it works, I understand it would create a saving of £70,000 a year, which would go back into the education budget. And generate returns which are more than you can get in most ISAs for local residents. It's crowdsource funded, so the issue for the first bond, given how small it is that crowd might be very small, but at the moment the discussion is happening as to how to open that up to local residents first, and then to go to institutional investors later. So even if the pilot doesn't exactly work that way, I think subsequent phases will. And as I say, what we're hoping is that it is replicated at scale after the pilot proves the kind of basic validity of the funding model.
Just in regards to the planning, really interesting question, because I think that planning has the ability to block sustainability and circular economy, but it also has the opportunity to open it up. And what we're doing in Brighton is actually looking at those different aspects and actually what will work quickly and what will work long term. So Brighton hasn't got circular economy policies in its planning policy yet, but what we've now got is planning policy officers that are starting to understand what circular economy is and are starting to look at things from a circular economy lens. And it's not just planning officers. There's a housing officer in this audience now who's come up to listen to this. He came to one of the workshops, one of the conferences, started to understand what circular was, and then the next day went back to his desk and changed the specification for housing to include and incorporate circular economy thinking. And for me, very much what we're trying to do is empower those individuals that are doing this on a day-to-day basis, that they can understand the opportunities and try and incorporate it into their day jobs.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Needham from Artelia. Just a question for yourself. In terms of Brighton, is Brighton the first place where this approach is being taken? And if it is, obviously with it being a Green Party-led council, how or are you contemplating getting that as an example and a message out with some learnings so that other councils can wake up to it?
No, absolutely. It's not something that Brighton isn't the leader on this. I have a term that I use quite a lot, which my academic colleagues don't like, which is plagiarism plus. Add value to somebody else's work. And there's some cities around the world that have done some brilliant work on what circular is. If you've been to some of the other stages, you'll have heard Amsterdam mentioned many, many, many times. There's some brilliant cities in the UK. Peterborough have done some great work. Leeds have done some great work. What we're doing in Brighton is just taking an approach based on the built environment, which I think is probably more unique, but we're also linking that with the visitor economy. What we are going to produce is a circular economy route map / strategy that will be downloadable and a template for other cities to use. It's not going to be saying this is what you should do in your city. It's going to be looking at what other cities are currently doing. And I've got a colleague from Holland who is actually looking at 40-odd strategies from around the world at the moment and just trying to hone it down to see what works best and how we can use that in the city. In a way, it's partly fueled by the fact that it's a green city or green politicians. In a way, it's also fed by the economic development team and the directors of environment and housing going, we've got a climate emergency and we need to change things. So I think we're in a position that we've got a huge opportunity to make a change, and the right people that 5 years ago wouldn't even known this topic are now embracing it because they see it as a fundamental need for the population in the city.
One last question. Where? Sorry?
Back.
Oh,
Back.
okay. Yes. You have the microphone behind you.
Hi, Stuart Boothman from Just Transition Wakefield. Tom was talking about social justice at the beginning, and everything that Andy and Dave have talked about kind of skirted around that. How do we ensure when we green our cities and introduce a circular economy that the most vulnerable are not left out of all of this?
Well, I'll start first, and I guess you guys can follow on. It sounds a bit of a cop-out, but it's just the joined-up thinking aspect. So whenever you put in a policy in place, it's looking at how that will affect different groups of people, how that's likely to play out, and engaging people in the process of making those decisions. And sometimes, and I think that particularly people on the left can be a little bit nervous about making things which aren't green more difficult. Now, my view is that we probably will need to do that, but in order to do that, we need to make being green and doing green activities much easier and much more cost effective, so that overall people are better off. And it's that sort of kind of dual lever approach that I think will be critical in my view.
I think for Leeds, we have considered two aspects of the justice element. One is the kind of procedural aspect and how decisions are taken, and making sure that all aspects or all communities in the city have a voice in that process. And as I said, that the transition is something that's felt to be done by the people, for the people, rather than to them. And the citizens' jury that we ran was a big part of that. It was a very, very effective way of bringing in communities that don't often contribute to the debate on climate change, and making sure that they are heard. And we as a city have committed that the results of the citizens' jury guide our activities from now on, and we report back to the jury on a quarterly basis. There's a second jury coming up on transport. I think the question will be, how can Leeds be a city where you can live without needing to use a car? And those kind of processes are vital to get people on board and create the sense that they have had their say, and they have kind of had a chance to shape the policies and the initiatives that come forward. The second aspect is the outcomes aspect. We know, having worked with the TUC and others, to look at kind of hotspots of areas and communities and sectors at risk from the low carbon transition. We know that roughly 10% of the jobs in the region will be affected negatively by the low carbon transition. And so working out spatially how you can channel some of the good things that happen, the low carbon jobs, towards the high carbon sectors, and making sure that that no community or sector is left behind in this process. There is a view that at times that might slow us down, and we need to be getting on with things. But my view is we need to slow down and take everyone with us. Otherwise, the Gilets jaunes movement and the kind of social backlash will slow us down much more at a later point. So, yeah, it is woven in absolutely into what we do. But if I'm honest, it's often really, really hard work to make sure that every party in the city has their say and then is affected fairly. But it is guiding what we do, absolutely.
And just add to that, I think in Brighton, there are so many groups that are looking at circular economy or sustainability or green or climate, and actually sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. And what we've found, so running Circular Brighton Hove, which is one of 270 cities around the world that are part of the Circular Economy Club, is we've got a nice network of around 1,000 people that are interested in the topic. Some are very knowledgeable, some are not, some are just interested in the topic. And we've used that as a way of bringing some information to the council, and the council going, okay, we want to explore this in more detail. Brighton hasn't got the answer yet. It's on a journey to try and put together a route map that will try and answer some of those social justice, some of those economic, and some of those environmental aspects. And that's very much, if we're looking at circular economy, it's sustainability for the 21st century. It's looking at it from a slightly different perspective. But a lot of what we do and everything that we're doing in this hall today, if we're looking at buildings, if we're looking at infrastructure, those people that are commissioning or planning or taking some responsibility need to embed within their thinking all of the three aspects that we're talking about. And social justice, social implementation, community is so critical.
Just add one small thing just to kind of support what you're saying there. I think we need, so there's only so much that can be done from practitioners on the ground. We also need the kind of global or the UK level policy response to support that. So I'll give an example of that. In my first job, I was working on a project where we went around retrofitting people's houses. We managed to get funding to retrofit homes where you put loft insulation in, and we calculated how much carbon emissions that retrofit project would save. And usually that's what you have to provide for the funding that you get. You say, we've saved this many tons of carbon emissions, kind of well done, box tick, kind of wah sort of thing. It was good. However, we decided to extend the project further by asking people, okay, so we said, you've saved about £300 on your energy bills each year. What are you most likely to spend that money on? And they said, okay, well, actually, we're going to have a holiday to wherever it was. And then so we added up the carbon emissions associated with what they had saved the money on. And when we did that, we actually found out that most of the carbon emissions that we'd saved were actually undermined by the rebound effect from what we're doing. Now, and for the average practitioner here, it's impossible for to deal with those issues. That's why you need this sort of joined up, multi-lever approach that we're talking about. But yeah.
One quick takeaway sentence: how do we get the cities we want? One each. Who wants to start? Tom.
How do we get the cities we want? I think we need to start acting now. I think we need to devolve power, and we devolve both the budget and the economic power and the political power to deliver them, and then be able to have bespoke solutions for different areas.
Andy.
I think cities need a positive view of the city they can be, and the climate agenda needs to be mainstreamed into the heart of housing and transport and urban regeneration, economic development, and it needs to be framed as a way of delivering a positive future that people can actively buy into.
David.
I think that for those of you that live in a city, it's how you can contribute individually. Can you get involved in local community groups? Can you get involved in circular economy clubs? That's a plug. But also, how can the people working in the cities understand what we're talking about today? And I think for me, that's one of the key things. We need to start joining up some of these big picture strategic activities. How do we link sustainable development goals with circular economy, with the biosphere, with carbon net neutral? All of these things which are absolutely critical at the moment under the banner of climate change and climate declaration. We need to provide some of the answers, or at least show that there are some opportunities to explore some solutions from some of the hard questions that we've got. So you've got the knowledge now. How do you take it back to your own cities?
It is a matter of everybody, and collaboration among all stakeholders is key. Big round of applause for our speakers. The audience, thank you. Thanks a lot.